Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler. We're still talking about recalls, and we are back with Amy Philpott, and we're going to be talking about some terminology and differentiation between different types of things that sound like recalls, but are not technically the same as other kinds of recalls. And Amy, thank you for joining us. And where are you going to take us with this section here?
So, Darin, what we're going to do is talk about what a food recall is and what it isn't. Because there's a lot of confusion around this, not only within the industry, but also with consumers and even customers. So, let's start with separating the two terms market withdrawal and recall. Industry gets this confused all the time. So, a market withdrawal is a voluntary action that a firm takes to remove a product from the marketplace. So, we call that a marketed product. When a product has already left our facility and it's out into the market, that's a marketed product. So, if we want to pull that back, then we withdraw it if the reason that we're doing that is for some non-violative reason. So it isn't breaking a law, it isn't contaminated, it meets the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, safety, but for some reason we want to pull it back. So maybe it doesn't meet our quality standards, but it doesn't pose a health threat. Maybe it's an off color, but again, doesn't pose a health threat. Okay.
Is this beyond seasonal? Like, I want to take all of my Christmas cereal boxes off the shelf?
Yeah, I don't think boxes that are 2 years old and have faded count. um, so,
No,
so
I mean like it's January now. I want to get I want, it's not old per se, but it's just like we don't need to be having Christmas, you see the Halloween marketing, you see the Christmas marketing, or you see, those cereal boxes. I don't know, those are the ones that come to mind. Sometimes candies, right? But now we're going to take them off the shelves because it's no longer Christmas. It's no longer Halloween. That would be kind of like a market withdrawal, but it has nothing to do with
yeah,
violating any kind of Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. It's just seasonal.
exactly. Again, in my experience with food withdrawals don't happen very frequently unless perhaps those seasonal removals count. But they don't happen very often. Because usually if we're going to pull, we as the industry are going to pull something off the market, it's because we have to. It's because our quality checks were fine. The product is fine from a quality perspective, but there's a threat to public health. And that's where the recall comes in. So both actions are taken by the firm. That's important. Both actions remove the product from the marketplace because in both cases, the product is a marketed product. It's left the facility of the original manufacturer. But the reason for pulling that product out of the marketplace is different. With a withdrawal, there is no threat to public health, and with a recall, there is. Now, we'll talk about varying classifications of hazards and risk to public health. But for our purposes now, a recall does pose some level of threat to public health. There are sub recalls. So if I make a product and I recall it and I sell it to you, Darin, then I have to notify you that the product I sold you is being recalled, and you, as the sub recall, need to recall it to whoever you sold it to, and it goes on down the line, right? A secondary recall is when I sell the product to Darin And Darin takes that and uses it as an ingredient in another product. And an entirely different product than the one I sold him then gets sold into the marketplace. So I sell him salt or cinnamon, and Darin puts the cinnamon in cookies and sells the cookies to his customers. If I recall that cinnamon, I'm the primary recalling company. Darin has to recall his cookies that include that cinnamon. He is now the secondary recaller. So we both have to issue a recall. I issue a public notice if it's a class 1 recall, which we'll go over. I issue a notice for my cinnamon. Darin issues a notice for his recalled cookies.
So, like in the Peanut Corporation of America case,
Why did that go back?
I don't know.
Sorry,
That's okay.
didn't mean for that to happen.
So, in the Peanut Corporation of America case, it sounds like not only was there the initial recall of the peanut product, but a huge secondary recall of all the candies and ice creams and whatnot, cake mixes and things that those companies that had the contaminated peanut products in now had to recall those. So it wasn't so much that it was a huge initial recall. I think it was probably a larger, a huge secondary recall.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a lot of examples like that where we call them rolling recalls. And that's not a technical term. It's just what the industry calls them, where it turns out that it appears that there are new recalls every day, but it's the same initial product, but
Right.
it's been used in so many different products that it appears like there are all these new recalls coming. The other thing I wanted to mention about market withdrawals and recalls is that oftentimes we'll see a withdrawal turn into a recall. So, for example, in 2011, with the Jensen Farms cantaloupe recall, 4 days before the recall was actually announced, the distributor, the company who marketed those cantaloupe, was watching the FDA updates about an outbreak that at the time FDA thought included cantaloupe. They weren't sure yet, but they thought it included cantaloupe. And the marketing company started reading the FDA reports and realizing that where illnesses were being reported matched their sales distribution map. So 4 days before that actual recall, before the actual linkage was made to Jensen Farms product, their marketing company contacted all of their customers and told them to withdraw the product, pull the product off the shelf, quarantine it until further notice. And then, of course, 4 days later, there was a definitive link between the outbreak and the melons, but the product had actually been removed from the shelf several days earlier because of this withdrawal. Another example is in 2013, Chobani initiated a market withdrawal of some yogurt, and they initially said it was due to quality concerns. There was some swelling and bloating of the containers. But there hadn't been any confirmed tests that there was a problem. Nevertheless, it obviously didn't meet their quality standards. So they issued the market withdrawal. And then about 4 or 5 days later, in early September, they came out and issued a recall. And they said, even though the data hasn't changed, we've identified a mold was responsible for the bloating, and it's not lethal, but it also doesn't meet our quality standards, and we're not sure whether it could make someone sick, so we're now issuing a recall and pulling it off the shelf, which technically it had already been pulled off the shelf a week earlier. And then finally, there's another example that comes to mind in 2016. Dole Fresh Vegetables had a presumptive positive for Listeria monocytogenes on one of their packaged salads. And it was presumptive, meaning that it hadn't been confirmed. But at that time, getting confirmation from a test result like that could take up to 5 days. Now it's much faster, but back then it took quite a few days to find out whether a presumptive positive was in fact a positive. And there are false positives all the time. Nevertheless, Dole decided to issue a market withdrawal because they wanted the product out of the marketplace in case it was potentially contaminated, but they didn't have the test results to actually say that it was. So they issued the withdrawal, and then about a week later, they got the test results and issued a recall. So sometimes you'll see a withdrawal turn into a recall. I will say, however, this happens a lot less often than it used to. I would say for the last 5 to 8 years, it is much more likely that a company will go straight to recalling than this intermediary step. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, the agency is less tolerable of that. And today, in this day and age, in this environment, they're more likely to say, okay, you can do that, but we're going to go out with our own public notice, which in essence turns out to be a recall for the company anyway. So that's one reason. Another reason is companies just want to get it over with. They don't want to continue to be in the news cycle in a negative story. So many of them will just say, just issue the recall now, and be done with it.
Well, I think there's two other things to note. One is that, you go back to the FD&C Act, which was originally written in the late, or well, passed, I mean, in the late 30s. We don't, we don't have the same kind of environment today. You did not have the same level of commercially packaged goods and ready to eat foods and hybrid retail and then as we do today.
Yeah.
Consumer preferences and consumer behaviors has definitely changed. But the other thing that's definitely changed, even within the last, you know, decade or two or three, is just, everything from science and rapid testing technologies and that really is changing the timeline that might have impacted the idea of going from a market withdrawal to a recall, whereas it would have taken time for the science, the results to catch up, kind of a situation where you now have that so much faster. You may just go right into a recall more expediently.
Yeah, exactly, Darin. Yeah, it often makes more sense. And also, there's also insurance considerations. For example, 10 years ago, contamination insurance for food companies was very hard to find, and very expensive when you could find it. Now there are a lot more policies, they're a lot more accessible. Uh, and I think having that insurance often gives the company the flexibility of saying, let's just do it,
Yeah.
and err on the side of caution. So types of recalls. This is where I want you to remember what we talked about in the first part about regulations and liability. So there are generally three types of recalls. One that a firm initiates, and these are often characterized in writing and in the news as being voluntary. Okay. And what that means is that the firm is made aware of a problem or potential problem that threatens public health, and they make the decision to issue a recall. There's also something that I have termed an agency encouraged recall. I don't think that's an actual term, and I don't know that there is an actual term for the
Seems,
circumstances under it.
yeah, it seems accurate to me.
Um, but there are times where maybe it isn't quite clear whether it's a company's product that's causing the problem, or isn't quite clear that there's a threat to public health. And so the company's saying, well, let's look at the information. We want to think about it. And if an agency feels strongly that, in fact, no, it is your product and it is a threat to public health, then they will strongly encourage a company to issue a recall. And it is generally prudent for a company to listen, because if they don't, they can often find themselves in the third type of recall, which is a mandatory recall. Now, I say they can find themselves in that situation, which is true, but I also want to make sure that it's clear, at least FDA has only used their mandatory recall authority once. And that was back in 2012 with a nut butter company. So they don't use this often, quite frankly. If a company doesn't do it on their own, the encouragement from the agency often sends a strong enough signal that they then go forward with a firm initiated recall.
I often find this is one of those things that journalists, if they hear a recall, they assume that it was mandated. And it's like, no, that's not always the case. In fact, the USDA cannot, by design, they do not have congressional authority or uh, the given powers from Congress to mandate a recall. Only the FDA can do that. And you're right. There's very few cases. There's not a big body. There's not a large body, if you will, of examples of a mandatory recall from the FDA. But even though you can have agency encouraged voluntary recalls, there's also times where the agency encourages that voluntary recall and companies decide not to do it. They decide not to abide by that, and that has gotten companies into a lot of trouble.
Yes, yeah, it does. And, also something to remember is that the mandatory recall authority that FDA has is relatively new. You're right, it's under the Food Safety Modernization Act, but the FDA has always had the power of publicity. And oftentimes that can be more convincing than anything else.
Yeah.
So, as I said, earlier, if a company does not want to send out a public notification, for example, well, FDA has the authority to put out its own publicity. And I guarantee it's not going to sound as nice as the one that I will help a company write. So it's to a company's benefit to look at the evidence, and yes, if it's weak, to bring it up. But if it cannot be resolved between a company and an agency, if you can't come to an agreement that there isn't public health and the agency is still pursuing it, then it behooves you to listen. So there are three classifications, and I want to make it clear that it is the agencies that determine the classification. So oftentimes I'll talk to food companies and they'll say, well, we'll determine, in our food plan, in our recall plan, they'll say, next step, determine classification. And I say, no, The companies do not determine the classification. The agencies determine whether it is a class 1, 2, or 3. And that's based on the health hazard. Okay. So in a class 1, this is the most serious. This is a situation where there is reasonable probability of serious adverse consequences or death to humans or animals. It's important to note that everything we're talking about applies to humans and human food and animal food. We call this class 1 a SACOTA because I guess here in Washington, D.C., we have to turn everything into an acronym. So serious adverse health consequences or death from or to humans or animals. Serious adverse health consequences or death to humans or animals, SACOTA. In class 2, there may be a temporary or medically reversible adverse health consequence, obviously no death. In class 3, there's not likely to cause an adverse health consequence. Okay, so class 1 recalls are your allergens, your 9 big allergens, your pathogenic foodborne illnesses like listeria, salmonella, norovirus, E. coli. Okay. Those require class 1 notifications, which is a public notification. Okay. Class 2 recalls are a little trickier because even though when you look up the definition on the FDA website, it'll say that it doesn't typically require a public notification, sometimes it does. So a class 2 might be things like foreign matter, specifically foreign objects or foreign matter that are maybe larger in size. There's a specific size limit that they put on it. If it's if it's smaller than that, it could actually be a class 1 because if it's a choking hazard, then it could then become a class 1. So might be class 2, might be class 1. Might need a public notification, may not need a public notification. So class 2 is very situational. And then class 3 might be things like mislabeling, but not mislabeling for an allergen. So if you mislabel for an allergen, remember that's class 1. But it might be you put the wrong weight on the packaging. Instead of 8 ounces, it's 6 ounces, and the package says 8. So you may have to pull that product back and issue a class 3 recall. Class 3 does not require public notification, but it does require that a company reach out to its consignees or to its customers, its wholesalers or distributors or retailers, so that they can then remove the product. And there may be the option of actually making a correction to a class 3 violation, such as putting a sticker on the packaging that has the correct weight on it. So it just depends on the food whether that's even possible or not.
I remember in the not too distant past, there was a argument. I believe it was some kind of a cake, and there were glass fragments, but it was on the cake, and the differentiation between the classes came down to whether the glass fragments were on the cake or in the cake. And I really appreciate how you talked about one, that the company itself is not where the determination of the class of the class of recall is made, but also that an actual recall classification is situation specific. Two cases may sound the same, but the situations may be completely different, kind of a situation. So it's not necessarily black and white or binary in terms of how it is or is not in a class. It sounds like there's a lot more information that's needed to make that determination.
Yeah, exactly. And they will even consider the the class or the They will even consider the typical consumer of that product.
Mm,
So, for example, if children consume your product,
right.
oftentimes the bar is a lot lower to get into that class one recall category than it would be if it's a product that children don't consume.
Yeah, I would, the Cronobacter, this is a weird analogy, but I would imagine that the Cronobacter that we saw with infant formula might have been a different level of urgency and persistence in terms of the focus on that if it was Cronobacter found in like beer or something like that.
Yeah.
Again, the situation specific aspect of it has to be taken into account.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really a conversation at the very beginning of a recall. It's a conversation with a company and their recall coordinator, okay, where the company is explaining the process that they use to make the product, the distribution of it. They may present marketing evidence as to who they market the product to that would give insight into the typical consumer. So there's a conversation that goes on between the company and the agency.
What also sounds like there's a conversation that needs to go on. It also sounds like there's a conversation that needs to go on, not only in terms of the recall plan and these different classifications, but how you are truly capturing and communicating likelihood and severity models. If you're looking at what's most convenient in terms of classification of recalls, but you're not acknowledging the fact that, yeah, but our product can easily become, a class two or a class one, we have to include that into our likelihood and severity plans when it comes to our overall food safety plan.
Yes, that's true. Absolutely. And the other factor is that classifications are made many weeks, if not months, after the actual recall. So you may be asking yourself, well, if public notification is tied to these classifications, but we don't know the classification for many weeks, if not months down the road, then how do we know whether we're going to issue a press release or not? And that's a very good question if you're thinking that.
That's a great
um,
point.
so typically what we do is when we have that conversation, the initial conversations with the agency and with our recall coordinator, we talk about classification. We talk about what is the likelihood that weeks and months down the road, the agency is going to classify this as a one, two, or three. And you talk through that, and then ultimately it's a decision of, well, based on our discussion today with the agency, it's the feeling is that it's likely that the agency will classify it as a two, but do we want to rely on that? And if they rule a one later on, then we have to issue a press release 2 months later. That's a nightmare. So oftentimes companies will just take the stricter classification so that they don't have the potential of having to go out with a different type of
Yeah.
response weeks or months later.
Because it's not just an additional, hit to a reputation and the idea of what's in the public's eye, but there's also the element of just recall notification fatigue. If
Yeah,
you keep putting out
yeah,
more and more and more things, at some point people are just going to be like, I'm not even paying attention anymore.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, when there is a risk, we want to get the message out accurately and quickly. But when there isn't, we also don't want to overstate, just like we don't want to understate the risk,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So alerts and warnings. Both USDA and FDA issue alerts or warnings. These are different than recalls. Remember, recalls can only be announced or carried out by a firm that produced the product. So there is no such thing as an FDA recall, even though you will read it all the time in the news and you'll hear people say that all the time. There is no such thing as an agency recall. Only firms issue recalls. The agencies can issue alerts and warnings. So on the right here, you see two screenshots. The top one is the FSIS or the USDA Recalls and Public Health Alert website. And then the bottom one is from FDA Alerts, Advisories, and Safety Information. And these are public notices that the agencies and CDC can issue alerts as well. That are used to inform consumers about potential health risks. And they're often issued when they have evidence that there is a health risk, but they aren't sure who made the product. So we saw this, probably one of the most well-known cases is the 2006 spinach E. coli outbreak, where in one evening, FDA announced that all spinach should not be consumed. Then later they amended that to be fresh spinach because people were saying, well, is it frozen? Is it canned? Right? We've gotten better with alerts. That was not a good example of a clear communication. But it is a good example of when an agency would issue one, right? Because they had evidence that spinach was the problem, but they didn't know whose product was the problem. So because it was ongoing, in other words, people were becoming ill as we were going through our day, it was a current outbreak, they published an alert to not eat spinach. So, and there are many, many other examples since then where both agencies, if they feel they need to where both agencies, if they need to provide additional information to a company's press release, or they don't have a company to attribute the problem to, that they go out with their own notice. Okay, so when is a warning not a warning? Warnings are supposed to give people time to respond, time to reduce or avoid the risk, right? They aren't a warning when they come weeks and months later. And I'm specifically mentioning this as it relates to classification of recalls. Remember, I brought up the point that sometimes we have to make the decision to issue a public notice, but we don't know what classification it will be. What we are seeing just recently, actually, I'd say in the last 6 months or so, is that the agencies are making their classification notices more readily available online when they are first posted, which means the news agencies are picking these classification notices up and running with it as if it's a brand new recall, as if it's brand new news about a recall that essentially ended already. So it starts another news cycle. And this is one of the communication functions that we have to be prepared for. It comes after the recall, but we need to be prepared for it.